Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Time feels like a river flowing in one direction, from past through present toward future. And this feeling is so fundamental to human experience that questioning it seems absurd, seems like denying gravity or claiming water flows upward. But the feeling of time's flow is not a direct perception of reality, but a construction, a story. The brain tells about the relationship between events. And when physicists examine the universe at its most fundamental level, they find no flow, no arrow, no distinction between past and future written into the equations, find only a four-dimensional block where all moments exist simultaneously, where what humans call past and what they call future are just directions in space-time, no different than up and down. And this creates a profound puzzle, a gap between how time appears in experience and how it exists in reality, between the subjective sense of moving through time and the objective structure that contains no movement, only arrangement, only the geometry of causation. And this gap suggests that the experience of time is not a feature of the universe, but a feature of consciousness. Not something discovered, but something manufactured. And understanding how this manufacturing happens, how the brain constructs the illusion of flow from raw sensory data and memory and anticipation, reveals something strange about what humans are, about how awareness works, about the mechanisms that create the sense of being a continuous self moving through a series of moments, rather than what might actually be the case, which is that there is no continuous self, and there are no discrete moments, but only patterns of neural activity that interpret themselves as experiencing time, when really they are just responding to change, just processing difference, just comparing present states with stored representations of past states, and calling that comparison memory, calling that experience history, calling that sensation the passage of time. But the passage is metaphor, is language, trying to capture something that has no literal motion, no actual flow, because nothing is passing, nothing is moving. There is only the fact of change, the fact that one configuration of matter gives way to another configuration, and the brain, being a system that persists across configurations, that maintains some continuity of structure, even as its content shifts, interprets this persistence as duration, as a self that endures, as an identity that travels from then to now. But the travelling is illusion. The self at each moment is different from the self at every other moment, shares some patterns, some connections, some information, but is not the same thing, is not a substance that moves, but a process that recurs. And what is called the experience of time is really the experience of this process recognizing its own recurrence, noticing that the current pattern resembles previous patterns, that there is continuity even though there is no identity, that memory creates the appearance of a past that the present self once inhabited, when really the past exists only as traces, as modifications to neural structure, as information encoded in synaptic weights. And these traces are not recordings, are not faithful representations, are reconstructions, are guesses about what must have happened based on fragmentary evidence, And every time a memory is recalled, it is reconstructed slightly differently, is altered by the present context, by current beliefs, by subsequent experiences, and so the past is not fixed, is not a stable foundation upon which the present stands, but is constantly being rewritten, constantly being adjusted to fit the story. The brain is telling about who it is and how it got here, and this means that personal history is fiction, not in the sense of being deliberately false, but in the sense of being narrative, being shaped by the requirements of coherence and meaning, rather than by pure correspondence to what actually occurred. And what actually occurred is anyway inaccessible, is gone. It exists only in the present, in the form of these unreliable traces that claim to point backward, but really only point to themselves, only demonstrate that something happened without being able to show exactly what. And the brain fills in the gaps, invents details, smooths over inconsistencies, creates a past that makes sense of the present, even if that past never happened quite the way it is remembered. And people are completely unaware of this invention, completely convinced that memory is retrieval, that remembering is like playing back a recording, when really it is more like improvising a story based on a few key words, more like confabulation than documentation, and the implications are vertiginous, because if the past is unreliable, then what is the present based on? What is the foundation of identity? If history is malleable, what does it mean to be the same person over time, if the time itself is constructed and the person at each moment is different, and the memories connecting them are fabricated? And perhaps the answer is that there is no foundation, no solid ground, no identity in the sense of something that persists unchanged, only the process of identification, the act of claiming continuity, the narrative that says, I am the one who did that, who experienced this, who will do something else tomorrow. And this narrative is not true or false, but functional, is a tool the brain uses to coordinate behavior across time, to plan, to learn, to maintain social relationships. Because others expect continuity, expect that the person they met yesterday will be recognizably the same person today. And so the brain provides that continuity, constructs that sameness, even though at the level of neurons and molecules, there is constant flux, constant replacement, constant change. Henri Bergson argued that there are two kinds of time, clock time and lived time, the abstract mathematical time of physics that divides duration into discrete instants, measurable and uniform, and the qualitative time of consciousness that cannot be divided, that is not made of moments, but is a continuous flow, an indivisible duration where past and present interpenetrate, where memory is not storage but preservation, where the whole of experience is always present, always accessible, not as separate events but as a cumulative whole. And Bergson called this duration, and he believed that science, by spatializing time, by treating it as if it were a line made of points, misses what time actually is in lived experience, misses the flow, the thickness, the way that consciousness is always multiple, always containing more than the present instant, always reaching backward into memory and forward into anticipation. And this multiplicity is what gives experience its richness, its texture, is what makes a melody more than a sequence of individual notes. Because the melody is heard as a whole, as a pattern that emerges from the relationship between notes rather than from the notes themselves. And this pattern exists only in duration, only in the continuous present that holds the past notes in memory while the current note is sounding. And without this duration, there would be no music, no meaning, no connection between moments, just isolated sensations with no relationship. And Bergson believed that the brain does not produce consciousness but limits it, filters it, reduces the totality of duration to the narrow slice that is relevant for action, for survival, for navigating the practical demands of living in a body. And what is called the present moment is really just this filtered slice, this pragmatic selection from the fullness of time and different states of consciousness. Different drugs, different practices can alter the filter, can expand the present, can make it thicker or thinner, can change how much of the past is felt to be co-present with the now. And this variability shows that the present is not a fixed instant, but a flexible window, a span that can be adjusted. And what determines the adjustment is not the external world, but the internal state. The brain's current configuration, its chemical balance, its attentional focus. And so the experience of time is not a passive registration of external temporal facts, but an active construction that varies with the observer, that is different for different species, different for different individuals, different even for the same individual in different circumstances. And this relativity of subjective time is separate from the relativity of physics, is about consciousness rather than space-time, is about how duration is experienced rather than how it is measured. And Bergson thought that science could never capture this experiential dimension, could never reduce durée to equations, because equations deal with space, and time deals with change, with becoming, with something that is not spatial and cannot be spatialized without losing its essential character. And whether Bergson was right about this is debatable. Neuroscience has made significant progress in understanding how the brain constructs temporal experience, has identified mechanisms involved in time perception, in the binding of events into sequences, in the calibration of subjective duration. But whether this understanding captures what Bergson meant by durée, whether it explains the qualitative feel of time passing, is less clear, is perhaps another instance of the explanatory gap. The hard problem of consciousness applied to temporality. The question of why there is something it is like to experience duration, rather than time just being a parameter in neural computations without any felt quality, without any phenomenology. The specious present, a term coined by William James, refers to the fact that what is experienced as now is not an instantaneous point, but a short interval, usually estimated at around 2 to 3 seconds, within which events feel simultaneous, feel co-present, and this interval is necessary for perception to work. Because if the present were truly instantaneous, if it had no duration, then there could be no perception of motion, no perception of change, no perception of anything except static snapshots, with no connection between them. And so the brain creates a window, a moving window that slides along the timeline, integrating information from the immediate past with information from the present instant. And within this window, there is no sense of before and after. Everything feels like it is happening now. And only when events fall outside the window do they become past, become memory, rather than perception. And the edges of this window are not sharp, are not clearly defined. There is a gradient where the recent past fades into history and the immediate future emerges into anticipation. And this fuzziness is why temporal order judgments are difficult, why people often cannot tell which of two closely spaced events occurred first, why the subjective sequence of events can differ from the objective sequence. And experiments show that the brain does not perceive events in the order they occur, but reorders them, retrospectively constructs a sequence that makes sense, that fits with expectations, that creates a coherent narrative. And this reordering can be demonstrated by showing people visual and auditory stimuli in close succession and asking them to judge which came first. And the answers are inconsistent, vary depending on attention, on prior exposure, on the semantic relationship between the stimuli. And what this shows is that temporal order is not given but inferred, is a conclusion the brain arrives at rather than a fact it registers. And the brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy, prefers a meaningful sequence to a faithful sequence. And this preference is not conscious, is not deliberate, is built into the perceptual mechanisms that construct experience. And so what is lived is not what happened, but what the brain decides happened. What fits the story, what makes sense in retrospect. and retrospect is the only perspective available, because by the time an event is experienced, it is already past, is already memory. The neural processing takes time. The signal has to travel from sense organs to cortex, has to be integrated, interpreted, bound into a unified percept. And all of this happens in the past, in the few hundred milliseconds before the event enters awareness, and so consciousness is always behind, always lagging, always commenting on what has already occurred, and the sense of being present, of experiencing now, is an illusion created by the brain, backdating its own representations, stamping them with a time signature that says this is happening now, when really it happened a moment ago. And the moment ago is imperceptible, is hidden by the smoothness of the construction, by the fact that the lag is constant and so feels like zero, feels like immediacy, when really there is a gap, a delay, a space between occurrence and awareness that is filled by processing, by the mechanisms that turn raw sensation into coherent experience. And within this gap, anything can happen. Any reordering, any editing, any adjustment that makes the story work. And there is no way to catch the brain in the act. No way to compare the experience to the reality, because the experience is the only access to reality, is the only data available. And so the illusion is perfect, is undetectable from within, can only be inferred from indirect evidence, from experiments that catch the brain making mistakes, from situations where the constructed sequence contradicts the known sequence, and these situations are rare, require careful setup, because most of the time the construction is accurate enough, is close enough to the actual order of events, that no discrepancy is noticed, no problem arises, and this is what the mechanisms are optimized for. Not perfect accuracy, but sufficient accuracy, good enough to navigate the world, to avoid predators, to catch prey, to coordinate action with perception. And beyond that threshold, there is no selective pressure, no reason for the system to be more precise, and so it is not. And the sloppiness is revealed only in edge cases, only when looked for, only when the philosopher or the neuroscientist designs experiments to probe the boundaries of temporal perception and discovers that the boundaries are not where common sense suggests they should be. Memory is not storage but transformation, not preservation but reconstruction, and every act of remembering changes what is remembered, alters the trace, modifies the engram, and this modification is not corruption, is not failure, is the way memory is supposed to work, because the function of memory is not to record the past but to inform the future, to extract patterns from experience that will be useful later, to generalize, to abstract, to create rules and heuristics that apply across situations. And this requires flexibility, requires that memories be updated when new information arrives, when context changes, when the significance of an event is reinterpreted in light of subsequent experience. And so memory is always current, is always reflecting the present state of understanding. And this is why eyewitness testimony is unreliable, why people can be completely confident in memories that are completely false, why families argue about what happened because each member remembers it differently, and each is certain their version is correct, and all of them are wrong. All of them are remembering not the event, but the last time they remembered the event, and each remembering leaves a new trace, slightly different from the previous trace, and over time the memory drifts, diverges from what actually happened, and there is no original to compare it to, no master copy that remains unchanged. The first encoding is itself an interpretation, is already shaped by attention, by expectation, by emotion, by all the factors that determine what gets noticed and what gets ignored. And so from the beginning, memory is selective, is partial, is biased, and every subsequent recall adds another layer of bias, another round of reconstruction. And what remains after years is often more fiction than fact, is a story that has been told and retold so many times that it has taken on a life of its own, has become part of identity, part of the narrative of who I am and where I came from. And this narrative is precious, is defended against contradiction, is maintained even in the face of evidence because it is not just information, is not just data, is meaning, is the framework through which life makes sense, and threatening the memory is threatening the self, is suggesting that the person is not who they think they are, that the past they rely on is unreliable, and most people cannot tolerate this suggestion, reject it, become angry, double down on their version, and this rigidity is not stubbornness, but self-protection, is the mind defending its coherence, maintaining its integrity against fragmenting forces, and the alternative, accepting that memory is unreliable, that the past is uncertain, that identity is built on sand, is too destabilizing for most, is a kind of epistemological vertigo that threatens to dissolve the ground beneath everything. And so, the illusion is maintained, the confidence is preserved, the memory is trusted even though it should not be, and life continues on this foundation of useful fictions, of pragmatic falsehoods, of stories that are not true but are necessary, and perhaps truth is not the right criterion. Perhaps what matters is not whether the memory corresponds to what happened, but whether it serves the present, whether it helps navigate current challenges, whether it contributes to functioning. And by that standard, most memories are good enough, are functional, even if they are not accurate, even if they are inventions, even if the past they depict never existed except in the retrospective construction that claims to be reporting it. And this is the deepest illusion of time, not that it flows or that the present is specious or that duration is constructed, but that there is a past at all, that history is something that happened rather than something that is happening now, in the present, in the act of remembering, in the process of telling the story. And the past that is remembered is not behind, is not earlier, is right here, is present, is part of the current configuration of neural states. And saying it is past is just a way of talking about certain kinds of present states, the ones that claim to refer to earlier configurations. But the earlier configurations are gone, do not exist, cannot be accessed, and what remains is only the claim, only the reference, only the trace that says, this is a memory, this is about then, but the saying is happening now, is present. And so the past collapses into the present, is revealed to be a mode of present experience rather than a separate domain. And if the past is present, then the future is too, is also a mode of current experience. The anticipation, the planning, the fear and hope and expectation that constitute futurity, and these are present states as well, are neural activity happening now that interprets itself as being about later. But the later never comes, never is experienced, because when it arrives it is now, is present, and the present is all there ever is the only time that exists, and the flow of time from past through present to future is a story told within the eternal now, is a way of organizing experience, of making sense of change, of creating narrative continuity across discontinuous moments. But the moments are not discontinuous, are not separate, because separation requires time. And time is what is being constructed, is the product, not the container, is what emerges from the activity of brains, not what brains exist within. And this inversion, this recognition that time is inside rather than outside, that temporality is a feature of consciousness rather than a feature of the universe, changes everything, makes the question not what time is but how time is made, not when things happen, but how happening is experienced, not whether the past is real, but what reality means when applied to something that exists only as a present claim about a vanished state. And these questions have no final answers, have only perspectives, only frameworks, only ways of talking that are more or less useful depending on context, depending on purpose. And the illusion of linear time is useful, is necessary for planning, for learning, for maintaining the fiction of personal identity that makes social life possible. But it is still illusion, is still construction, is still something the brain does rather than something the brain discovers. And knowing this does not make the illusion disappear, does not make time stop feeling like it flows, because the feeling is built in, is automatic, is not subject to voluntary control, but the knowing changes the relationship to the feeling, creates distance, creates perspective, makes it possible to see the machinery at work, to recognize that what feels like the fundamental structure of reality is actually the fundamental structure of experience. And experience is not reality, but a model of reality, a map, not the territory, a useful approximation that is wrong in systematic ways. And the wrongness matters when the goal is understanding rather than functioning, when the question is what time is rather than how to use it. And these questions have occupied philosophers for millennia, have generated countless theories, countless arguments, and none have settled the matter because the matter is not empirical, is not something that can be resolved by more data or better experiments, is conceptual, is about what categories to use, what framework to adopt, what language game to play, and different games give different answers. And there is no metagame from which to judge which game is correct. Only pragmatic considerations, only questions about which framework is most useful, for which purposes, and for most purposes the folk framework is sufficient. The common sense view that time flows and the past is real, and memory is retrieval, and only when that framework breaks down, only when the contradictions become too obvious or the questions become too fundamental, is there reason to look for alternatives? To consider that maybe time does not flow, maybe the past is not real, maybe memory is not retrieval. And these maybes are not conclusions but invitations, not statements of fact but suggestions to look again, to question the obvious, to doubt the immediate, to recognize that the illusion of linear time is so convincing precisely because it is illusion, because it's made to be convincing, because that is its function, and seeing through it does not require rejecting it, does not require abandoning temporal language or pretending that past and future do not exist, only requires holding them lightly, provisionally, as useful fictions rather than ultimate truths, as tools rather than discoveries, as constructions rather than constraints. And in that lightness there is freedom. Not freedom from time, but freedom within it. Freedom to recognize that the experience is made, is chosen in some sense, even if not consciously. And what is made can be remade. What is chosen can be chosen differently. And the architecture of temporal experience, while deeply ingrained, while largely automatic, is not completely fixed, can be altered through practice, through attention, through deliberate cultivation of different modes of awareness. And these alterations do not reveal the true nature of time, but reveal that there is no true nature, no fact of the matter, only different ways of experiencing, different ways of constructing, different ways of being temporal creatures in a universe that may not be temporal at all, that may be timeless, eternal, a block, where all moments exist at once and the flow is purely in the eye of the beholder, in the structure of consciousness that moves through the block, not because the block is moving, but because consciousness is change, is process, is the activity of comparing states and calling that comparison time. And if this is right, then time is mind-dependent, is subjective in a radical sense, is not something that would exist without observers to construct it. And the universe before consciousness, before brains, was not a universe in time, but a universe of timeless physical states, of mathematical relationships, of geometry without duration, and only when matter organized itself into patterns that could represent their own history, that could compare past states with present states, did time emerge. Did temporality become a feature of the world? Not of the physical world, but of the phenomenal world. The world is experienced, and this emergence is recent, is evolutionary. Recent is less than 1 billion years old in a universe that is 14 billion years old. And for most of the universe's history, there was no time, no flow, no past or future, just configurations of matter energy, obeying laws that contain no temporal asymmetry, no preferred direction. And even now, time exists only locally, only in the small pockets of the universe, where consciousness has emerged, where nervous systems have evolved the capacity to construct temporal narratives, and the rest of the universe remains timeless, remains a four-dimensional block. And what is called the flow of time is the motion of awareness through that block. And the motion is not in the block, but in the awareness. Is a property of minds, not of space-time. And this might be the final truth about time, that it is ours, that we made it, that the illusion of linear time is not an illusion of time, but the creation of time, the bringing into being of something that would not otherwise exist. And in that creation, there is something profound, something that makes consciousness significant, not because it reveals the world, but because it transforms the world, adds temporality to what was timeless, adds meaning to what was bare fact, adds story to what was merely structure. And whether this addition is valuable, whether time is something worth creating, is a question each moment must answer for itself, right here in this specious present that claims to be flowing, but is really just being. Just the fact of awareness watching itself and calling that watching time. Meaning was not invented, but was given, was not constructed, but was inherited, was not the product of individual reflection, but was the air that was breathed, the framework that was absorbed, the structure that made sense of suffering, of labor, of death, of everything that otherwise would be unbearable. And this given meaning came from stories, from gods, from hierarchies that extended beyond the human into the cosmic, into realms where purposes were assigned, where roles were fixed, where every life, no matter how small, had significance, because it was part of a larger pattern, a divine plan, a cosmic order that justified suffering, that explained inequality, that made death not an end, but a transition. And the transition was to something, was leading somewhere, was part of a narrative that continued beyond the visible, beyond the mortal, beyond the contingent facts of this world, into eternal truths that grounded everything. And the grounding is what modernity has lost, is what the Enlightenment destroyed, is what science dissolved by showing that the cosmic order was projection, was fiction, was the human need for meaning imposed onto a universe that has no meaning, that cares nothing for human purposes, that operates according to laws that are indifferent to whether anyone suffers or flourishes. And the indifference is what modern consciousness must confront, must live with, must somehow survive, and the survival is difficult, is producing the crisis that thinkers have been naming for centuries. The meaning crisis, the disenchantment, the death of God that Nietzsche announced not as celebration, but as diagnosis, as the recognition that the framework had collapsed, that the stories no longer worked, that the gods were no longer believable. And the unbelievability was not failure of faith, but was the inevitable result of knowledge, of the scientific worldview that explained through mechanism what had been explained through purpose, that showed causes where there had been reasons, that revealed the universe to be vast and old and empty of anything like human meaning. And the emptiness is what modern consciousness inherits, is the vacuum that religion once filled, is the absence that creates the crisis, because humans need meaning, are built to seek it, are suffering without it, are experiencing the pointlessness as pathology, as depression, as the epidemic of despair that characterizes wealthy secular societies, where material needs are met but existential needs are not, where comfort is abundant but purpose is absent, where life is long but feels empty, and the emptiness is not new, but the awareness of it is new, is the result of losing the stories that made the emptiness tolerable, that covered it over, that provided the illusion of significance. An illusion is what the religious frameworks were, but they were functional illusions, were useful fictions, were false but necessary, and the necessity is what modernity has trouble acknowledging, has trouble accepting, because modernity is committed to truth, to science, to the rejection of comfortable lies, but the rejection has costs, is leaving people without the resources to make sense of existence, without the narratives that make suffering meaningful, without the structures that provide purpose. And purpose cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual will, cannot be generated by deciding to care about something, because caring requires reasons, and reasons require frameworks, and frameworks are inherited, not invented, are received, not constructed, are given by cultures, by traditions, by the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced the same emptiness and created stories to fill it. And the stories worked not because they were true, but because they were shared, were collective, were providing roles and meanings that were recognized by others, that were part of a social world where purpose was public, was confirmed, was real in the way that social facts are real. And social facts require agreement, require participation, require that people act as if the meaning is there. And the as if is what modernity has trouble with, is what secular consciousness resists, because acting as if seems like pretending, seems like bad faith, seems like the self-deception that Sartre warned against. And so modern individuals are caught between the need for meaning and the inability to believe in the sources of meaning, between the hunger for purpose and the knowledge that purpose is not inherent but is imposed, is constructed, is chosen. And chosen meaning feels arbitrary, feels thin, feels like it could be otherwise, and therefore feels like it is not really meaning at all, but is just preference, just a subjective valuing that has no grounding, no justification, no claim to be anything more than personal taste. And taste is not enough, is not providing the weight that meaning requires, is not making life feel significant, is not answering the question of why any of this matters. And the why is the question that modernity cannot answer, is the question that haunts secular consciousness, is the question that produces the crisis. And the crisis is not just intellectual, but is visceral, is felt, is experienced as the flatness of existence, as the sense that nothing really matters, that everything is permitted because nothing is forbidden, that values are just opinions, and opinions are just brain states, and brain states are just physics. And the physics is indifferent, is not caring, is not providing any reason to do anything, to be anything, to continue existing. And the continuing is what becomes questionable, is what the meaning crisis threatens, is why suicide rates rise, why despair spreads, why affluent societies are seeing increases in deaths of despair, in overdoses, in suicides, in all the ways that people exit when existence feels unbearable. And the unbearable is not material, but is existential, is not about lacking things, but about lacking reasons, lacking purposes, lacking the framework that makes effort meaningful, that makes suffering tolerable, that makes life worth living. And the worth is what is missing, is what cannot be found, is what modernity has destroyed without replacing. And the replacements that have been tried are failing, are not working, are revealing themselves to be inadequate substitutes for what was lost. And what was lost was not just belief in God, but was the entire worldview that made God plausible, that made divine purpose conceivable, that made cosmic meaning possible. And the possible is what has been eliminated, is what science has shown to be projection, to be anthropomorphism, to be the mistaken attribution of human qualities to the universe. And the mistake is understandable, is natural, is the way that consciousness makes sense of the world. But it is still mistake, is still error, is still something that cannot be sustained once knowledge advances, once the mechanisms are understood, once the causes are revealed and the revealing is irreversible, is not allowing return to innocence, is not permitting the restoration of belief, is creating the permanent condition of disenchantment, of knowing that the meanings are not discovered but are created, are not inherent but are imposed, and the imposed cannot carry the weight that the discovered could carry, cannot provide the grounding that the inherent provided, cannot make life feel significant in the way that cosmic purpose made it feel significant. And so modernity is searching, is trying to find secular substitutes, is trying to create meanings that do not depend on the supernatural, on the transcendent, on the stories that are no longer believable. And the substitutes that are tried are varied, are including humanism, the belief that human values are sufficient, that human flourishing is purpose enough, that making life better for people is meaning enough. But humanism is thin, is not providing the depth that religious meaning provided, is not explaining why human flourishing matters, is not grounding value in anything beyond human preference. And preference is not enough, is not answering the question of why this preference rather than another. Why care about flourishing rather than about something else? And the something else is always available, is always an option. And without grounding, the choice feels arbitrary, feels like it could be different. And what can be different feels less real, less binding, less meaningful. And so humanism satisfies some, but not others, works for those who do not need deep grounding, but does not work for those who do, who need reasons that extend beyond the human, beyond the contingent, beyond the arbitrary. And these people are searching, are trying other substitutes, are trying nationalism, the belief that the nation provides purpose, that serving the collective gives life meaning, that sacrifice for the group is the answer. But nationalism is dangerous, is leading to conflict, is producing the us versus them that justifies violence, that makes the other into enemy, that converts the search for meaning into the justification for harm, and the harm is what makes nationalism unsustainable, as meaning is what reveals it to be destructive, to be the kind of substitute that is worse than the absence it is trying to fill. And so nationalism is rejected by many, is seen as the wrong answer, but the rejection leaves the question open, leaves the search continuing. And another substitute that is tried is ideology, the belief that political movements provide purpose, that working for justice or equality or liberation gives life meaning. That commitment to the cause is the answer, and for some this works, is providing the structure that was lost, is giving roles and purposes, and the sense of being part of something larger, something important, something that justifies effort and sacrifice. But ideology is also dangerous, is also producing conflict, is also dividing the world into believers and heretics, is creating the certainty that is intolerant, that is unwilling to coexist with doubt. And the doubt is what ideology cannot tolerate, is what it must suppress. And the suppression is violence, is coercion, is the same problem that religion had, that any totalizing meaning system has, which is that it cannot allow alternatives, cannot permit questioning, cannot coexist with the plurality that modernity also values, and so ideology is failing as substitute, is producing as much harm as good, is not solving the meaning crisis, but is creating new problems, new conflicts, new reasons for despair, and the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes modern consciousness, when all the substitutes are tried and found wanting, when the search for meaning exhausts itself, when the recognition arrives that maybe meaning cannot be found, cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual or collective will, because meaning was never something that humans made, but was something they received, was given by frameworks that emerged over centuries, that were refined through generations, that worked because they were inherited, not because they were chosen. And choosing meaning is the modern problem, is the thing that modernity demands, but that consciousness cannot do, because choice requires reasons, and reasons require grounding, and grounding is what is missing, is what was lost with the death of God, with the collapse of cosmic purpose, with the recognition that the universe is indifferent, and the indifference is the truth, is what science reveals, is what honesty requires accepting, and the acceptance is what some philosophers advocate, is what Camus called absurdism, is the response that acknowledges the meaninglessness while refusing to be destroyed by it, that confronts the absurd without fleeing into suicide or into false hope, that lives with full awareness of the void while continuing to live, while continuing to act, while continuing to find moments of joy and connection and beauty, even though none of it means anything in the cosmic sense. None of it matters beyond the moment. None of it will be remembered once consciousness ends, and the ending is inevitable, is coming for everyone, is the final proof that nothing matters, that all effort is futile, that existence is temporary and meaning is impossible. And yet the absurd response is to continue anyway, is to rebel against the meaninglessness, not by denying it, but by living in spite of it, by affirming life without justification, by finding satisfaction in the act of living itself, rather than in any purpose that living serves. And the serving is what is abandoned, is what the absurd lets go of, is what is recognized as impossible. And the impossible is what modernity must accept, must live with, must somehow survive. And the survival is not guaranteed, is not easy, is requiring a transformation of consciousness, a new way of being human that does not need cosmic meaning, that does not require divine purpose, that can tolerate the void without filling it, that can live with the knowledge that existence is contingent, that meaning is constructed, that everything could be otherwise. And the otherwise is what makes nothing necessary, nothing absolute, nothing secure, and the insecurity is the permanent condition, is what modernity offers, is what the horizon of meaning looks like when the horizon keeps receding, when the destination is revealed to be illusion, when the search is recognized as endless because there is nothing to find, no meaning to discover, no purpose to uncover, only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence of the universe that does not answer, that does not care, that does not provide what humans need. And the need is real, is not going away, is producing the crisis that may not have solution, that may be the permanent condition of secular consciousness, of enlightened awareness, of the knowledge that liberates from illusion, but enslaves to despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes the horizon of meaning in modernity. The flat landscape where purposes used to stand, where gods used to reign, where cosmic order used to justify suffering, and now there is nothing, or there is only what can be constructed, what can be chosen, what can be performed, and the performance feels hollow, feels fake, feels like going through motions, without conviction, and conviction is what is missing, is what cannot be manufactured, is what made religious meaning work, and without it the secular substitutes fail. The humanisms and nationalisms and ideologies all fail because they lack the weight, lack the depth, lack the grounding that conviction requires, and the requires is what consciousness needs, is what makes meaning meaning rather than just preference. And preference is not enough, has never been enough, will never be enough, because humans are built for meaning, are requiring it, are suffering without it. And the suffering is the crisis, is the modern condition, is the permanent state of existence at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon is empty, is revealing nothing, is offering nothing except the recognition that meaning was always illusion, was always projection, was always the human need imposed onto a universe that provides nothing, that offers nothing, that is indifferent to whether anyone finds meaning or drowns in meaninglessness. And the drowning is happening, is visible, is the epidemic of despair, is the meaning crisis that modernity cannot solve, because the solution would require believing what cannot be believed, accepting what knowledge has revealed to be false, returning to illusions that have been seen through. And the seeing through is irreversible, is permanent, is leaving consciousness stranded at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon extends forever and reveals nothing, where the search continues because it must, but where nothing is found because nothing is there, because meaning is not discovered but was always created, was always the story that consciousness told itself, and the story has ended, has been revealed as story. And what remains is the silence, the emptiness, the void that religions were covering, that purposes were filling, that cosmic orders were organizing, and the organizing is gone, is lost, is leaving consciousness alone with existence, with the fact of being without the reason for being, with life without purpose, with experience without significance. And the without is the horizon, is what modernity sees when it looks for meaning. And the looking continues, must continue, because consciousness cannot stop seeking what it needs. But the seeking finds nothing, reveals nothing, discovers nothing except the fact that there is nothing to discover, that the horizon is empty, that meaning is absent, that purpose is impossible, and the impossible is what must be lived with, must be endured, must be survived, and the survival is what absurdism attempts, what Camus offered, what some find sufficient, but many do not. Many cannot. Many are destroyed by the emptiness, by the meaninglessness, by the recognition that nothing matters and nothing can be done to make it matter. And the cannot is the tragedy, is the modern condition, is the permanent crisis at the horizon of meaning, where meaning has ended, where purpose has collapsed, where existence continues but significance does not. And the does not is what remains, is what persists, is what characterizes life at the horizon, where the horizon is empty, where the search reveals nothing, where consciousness is alone with its need for meaning in a universe that provides none, that offers none, that will never provide any, because meaning is not there, was never there, is only here in consciousness, in the stories that are told, in the illusions that are maintained, and the maintaining is what modernity cannot do, is what knowledge prevents, is what honesty forbids, and so the crisis continues, the despair persists, the horizon remains empty, and consciousness must somehow survive, must somehow continue, must somehow live without meaning, without purpose, without the grounding that makes existence bearable, and the bearable becomes questionable, becomes doubtful, becomes the thing that many cannot achieve, and the achieving is the challenge, is the task, is what modernity demands without providing resources, without offering solutions, without giving answers, because there are no answers, there is no solution, there is only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence, and the silence is what speaks, is what reveals, is what remains at the horizon of meaning where meaning has ended, and nothing has replaced it, and nothing ever will. Putnam sat in a room and imagined two planets, identical in every way, except one, Earth and twin Earth, perfect mirrors of each other down to the last atom, the last thought, the last whispered word, and on Earth there is water, H2O, the molecule that makes up oceans and rivers and rain, and on twin Earth there is also water, but it is not H2O, it is XYZ, a completely different substance with different chemical structure, different molecular bonds, different properties at the microscopic level. Yet to everyone living on twin Earth it looks exactly like water, tastes exactly like water, behaves exactly like water. It fills their lakes and falls from their clouds and quenches their thirst just as water does on Earth. Now imagine two people, one on Earth and one on twin Earth. Call them both Oscar, and these two Oscars are molecule for molecule identical. Same brain structure, same neural patterns, same memories, same thoughts, same internal psychological states. Everything inside their heads is exactly the same. And both Oscars look at a glass of liquid and say the word water. They both think they are referring to the same thing. They both believe they know what water is, but Putnam asks a simple question that shatters centuries of philosophy. Are they actually referring to the same thing? And the answer is no. Earth Oscar's word water refers to H2O. Twin Earth Oscar's word water refers to XYZ. Same word, same internal mental state, but different meanings, different references, different extensions in the world. And this means that meaning is not determined by what is in the head. Meaning is not a function of internal psychological states. Meaning is not private, not subjective, not locked inside the skull waiting to be discovered through introspection. The tradition, before Putnam, stretching back through Locke and Hume and Descartes, believed that meanings were mental entities, that words were connected to ideas in the mind, that reference was mediated by internal representations, by concepts, by mental images, and if you wanted to know what someone meant by a word, you had to look inside their head, examine their thoughts, map their mental contents, and this made sense, it felt right. It aligned with the intuition that language is personal, that each person has their own private understanding of words, their own associations, their own mental dictionary, but Putnam showed that this entire picture was wrong, that two people could have identical mental contents and still mean different things by the same word. That meaning reaches beyond the skull, beyond the brain, beyond psychology entirely, into the world itself, into the environment, into the physical and social context that determines what words actually refer to. This is semantic externalism, the view that meanings are not in the head but out in the world. That reference is determined not by internal states but by external relations, by causal connections between words and things, by the history of how a word came to be used, by the community of speakers who share the word, by the natural kinds that exist independently of human thought. And this means that you can be wrong about what you mean. You can use a word your entire life and not know what it really refers to. You can have perfect confidence in your understanding and still be completely mistaken, because meaning is not something you possess. It is something you participate in, something that exists in the space between speakers and world, between language and reality, between words and the things they pick out. Putnam's argument did not stop at twin earth. He pushed further. He talked about the division of linguistic labour, the fact that most people do not know the technical details of what their words refer to. Most people cannot define gold in terms of atomic number, cannot distinguish an elm from a beech, cannot explain what makes aluminum different from molybdenum. Yet they use these words successfully. They refer to these things accurately, and they do so not because they have the right mental contents, but because they are embedded in a community where some people do have the expertise, where metallurgists know about aluminum, where botanists know about elms, where chemists know about gold. And when ordinary speakers use these words, they defer to the experts. They rely on the division of labour. They trust that somewhere in the linguistic community there are people who know what these words really mean, who can distinguish the real thing from the fake. And this trust is what allows language to function, what allows reference to succeed even in the absence of individual knowledge. This overturns the Cartesian picture entirely. Descartes believed that knowledge began with the self, with the contents of consciousness, with what could be known through introspection, and from there one built outward to knowledge of the world. But Putnam showed that the order is reversed, that knowledge of meaning requires knowledge of the world first, that you cannot know what you mean without knowing what your words refer to, and you cannot know what your words refer to just by looking inside your own mind. You have to look outside to the physical environment, to the social context, to the history of usage, to the experts who maintain the standards of reference. And this means that the self is not the foundation of knowledge, but a participant in a larger system, a node in a network of linguistic and social relations that determine meaning collectively, not individually, externally, not internally. Frege tried to solve the problem of meaning differently. He distinguished between sense and reference, between the mode of presentation and the thing presented, and he believed that sense was in the mind, that it mediated reference, that two people could refer to the same thing through different senses, like the morning star and the evening star, both referring to Venus, and this preserved the idea that meaning had a mental component, that internal states mattered. But Putnam's argument cut through this because on twin earth, Oscar and his counterpart have the same sense, the same mode of presentation, the same mental mediation, but they do not have the same reference. They are not talking about the same substance, and this means that sense alone does not determine reference. that no amount of mental content can fix what a word picks out in the world, that reference requires something beyond sense, beyond psychology, beyond anything that can be captured by introspection or phenomenology. Kripke reinforced this from another angle. He argued that names and natural kind terms were rigid designators, that they referred to the same thing in all possible worlds, not by virtue of satisfying a description, but by virtue of causal historical chains, that the word water refers to H2O because it was introduced to refer to a certain substance, and that reference was passed down through generations of speakers, through baptism and transmission, through ostension and use. And even if speakers lost track of what the substance was, even if they forgot its chemical composition, even if they developed false beliefs about it, the words still referred to the same thing, because reference is not determined by beliefs but by the causal connection between word and world, by the chain that links current usage back to the original act of naming, back to the moment when the word was first attached to the thing. This has radical implications for psychology, because it means psychology cannot determine reference, cannot tell you what your words mean, cannot give you the extension of your terms just by examining your mental states. And this was a blow to cognitive science, to theories of mind that tried to explain language purely in terms of internal representations, in terms of concepts and mental models and computational processes, because Putnam and Kripke showed that none of this is enough. That meaning leaks out of the head, that it requires the world, requires the community, requires the causal historical context, and without these external factors there is no meaning at all, just empty sounds, just syntax without semantics, just symbols shuffling around inside the skull with no connection to reality. Yet people resist this conclusion. They cling to the intuition that they know what they mean, that their words are transparent to them, that meaning is something they possess and control. And this resistance is understandable because semantic externalism is deeply unsettling. It suggests that we are strangers to our own language, that we do not fully understand the words we speak, that meaning is not something we create, but something we inherit, something we are thrown into, something that precedes us and exceeds us and determines what we can say before we even open our mouths. Wittgenstein saw this too, though from a different direction. He argued that meaning is use, that words get their meaning from the language games they are embedded in, from the forms of life that give them context, and he rejected the idea of private language, the idea that meaning could be purely internal, purely subjective, because a private language would have no standards of correctness, no way to distinguish between following a rule and merely thinking one is following a rule, and without standards there is no meaning, just the illusion of meaning, just the feeling of understanding without actual understanding. And this is why language must be public, why it must be shared, why it requires a community of speakers who can correct each other, who can point out mistakes, who can maintain the norms that make reference possible. Putnam took this further. He showed not just that language is public, but that meaning is not even fully determined by the community, that it reaches beyond the community into the world itself, that natural kind terms like water and gold and tiger refer to whatever has the same underlying nature as the paradigm samples, the same deep structure, the same essential properties, and this means that meaning can outrun knowledge, that a community can use a word correctly even when they have false beliefs about what they are referring to, even when their theories are wrong, even when their understanding is incomplete, because the word latches onto the real essence, the objective structure, the natural kind that exists independently of human thought. And the world itself constrains meaning, corrects mistakes, determines reference in ways that no internal psychological state can capture. This is why Aristotle was not wrong when he talked about water, even though he did not know about molecules, even though his theory of elements was false. He was still referring to H2O because his word water was causally connected to the same substance our word water refers to, because the reference was fixed not by his beliefs, but by the stuff itself, by the samples he pointed to, by the liquid he drank and swam in and observed, and the continuity of reference across theory change, across conceptual revolutions, across the abandonment of entire frameworks, shows that meaning is anchored in the world, not in the mind, that it survives the death of theories because it was never dependent on theories in the first place. But this raises a puzzle. If meaning is not in the head, if psychological states do not determine reference, then what role does the mind play at all? What is psychology supposed to study if not meaning, if not the contents of thought, if not the representations that mediate between language and world? And Putnam's answer is that psychology studies something real. It studies mental states. It studies computational processes. It studies the functional organization of cognition, but it does not study meaning, because meaning is not a psychological phenomenon. It is a semantic phenomenon. It is a relation between words and world, between signs and reference, between language and reality, and this relation is not mediated by anything in the head. It is direct. It is external. It is constituted by causal and social factors that lie beyond the reach of introspection, beyond the scope of neuroscience, beyond the explanatory power of any psychological theory. Fodor resisted this. He wanted to preserve a role for internal content, for narrow content, for something in the head that could do explanatory work. And he argued that even if meaning is wide, even if reference is external, there must be something narrow that explains behavior, some internal state that mediates between input and output, some mental representation that the cognitive system manipulates. And he tried to carve out a space for psychology by distinguishing between wide content, which depends on the environment, and narrow content, which does not, which is purely internal, purely psychological, purely computational. But this move was always unstable because narrow content turned out to be elusive, hard to define, hard to individuate, hard to see how it could play the explanatory role Fodor wanted it to play. And many philosophers concluded that narrow content was a myth, that there was no such thing, that all content was wide, that meaning was always externalist, always dependent on factors beyond the head, and if psychology wanted to explain behavior, it would have to appeal to wide content, to states that are individuated by their relations to the environment, to representations that are only representations in virtue of their connections to what they represent. This is deeply counterintuitive because it means that two people in identical internal states could be thinking different thoughts, could be believing different things, could be referring to different objects, just because they are in different environments, just because their words have different causal histories, just because the world around them is structured differently. And this seems to violate the intuition that mental states are internal, that what you're thinking is determined by what is going on inside your head, that consciousness is private, that the contents of experience are immediately accessible to introspection. But Putnam and Kripke showed that this intuition is wrong, that mental states are not self-intimating, that you can be mistaken about what you're thinking, that the meanings of your thoughts depend on facts about the world that you may not know, that reference is opaque, that you can use words successfully without understanding what they mean, that language works not because speakers have perfect knowledge, but because they are embedded in networks of reference that do the work for them, that connect words to things through mechanisms that operate below the level of consciousness, below the level of intentional control. Burge extended this argument to mental content itself. He argued that not just linguistic meaning, but thought itself is individuated externally, that beliefs and desires are identified by their relations to the environment, that you could not have a belief about water if you lived in a world with no water, that mental content is essentially relational, essentially dependent on what exists outside the mind, and this means that the mind is not a self-contained system, not a module that could be studied in isolation, not a computational device that processes inputs according to internal rules, but an open system a system that is constituted by its interactions with the world, that is shaped by its environment, that cannot be understood without reference to the physical and social context it is embedded in. This has implications for artificial intelligence, for the question of whether machines can think, because if meaning is external, if reference depends on causal historical connections, if mental content is individuated by relations to the environment, then a computer program, no matter how sophisticated, cannot have genuine thoughts unless it has the right connections to the world, unless it is embedded in the right kind of causal network, unless it participates in the same linguistic and social practices that give human words their meanings. And this suggests that thought is not just computation, not just symbol manipulation, not just syntactic operations on formal structures, but something that requires embodiment, requires situatedness, requires participation in a form of life, and a brain in a vat, no matter how complex its internal processes, would not be thinking about water or trees or anything else, because its words would not be connected to anything, would not refer to anything, would be empty symbols with no semantic content, no meaning, no reference, just syntax running in a void. Putnam himself later came to doubt some of his own arguments. He worried that semantic externalism led to metaphysical realism, to the view that there is a fixed, determinate way the world is, independent of human conceptual schemes, independent of language, independent of theory, and he came to think this was incoherent, that it made reference magical, that it required a God's eye view, a perspective from nowhere that could compare words to things without being situated in any particular framework, and he moved toward internal realism, toward the view that truth and reference are always relative to a conceptual scheme, always dependent on the practices and norms of a community, always constrained by what Quine called the tribunal of experience, but never fully determined by it. And this introduced a tension, a pull between the external world that constrains reference and the internal practices that constitute meaning, a tension that Putnam never fully resolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, because meaning lives in that tension, in the space between mind and world, between language and reality, between what we intend and what our words actually pick out. Dennett approached this from yet another angle. He argued that meaning is not a real property but a useful fiction, that intentional states are not natural kinds but interpretive stances, that when we attribute beliefs and desires, we are not discovering facts about the mind but adopting a strategy for predicting behaviour. And from this perspective, the question of whether meaning is in the head or in the world dissolves. Because meaning is not anywhere, it is not a real thing but a pattern we impose, a way of organising our understanding of complex systems. And the intentional stance works whether we apply it to humans or thermostats or chess programs. The difference is just pragmatic, just a matter of what level of description is most useful for prediction and explanation. Not a matter of what really has meaning and what does not, because nothing really has meaning. Meaning is always an interpretation, always a projection, always a way of seeing that could be otherwise. But this seems too deflationary, too quick to dismiss the felt reality of meaning, the undeniable sense that words do connect to things, that thoughts are about the world. That reference is not just a useful fiction but a real relation, and even if we cannot fully explain how this relation works, even if semantic externalism leaves gaps and puzzles, it at least takes seriously the intuition that language matters, that what we say makes a difference, that truth is not just coherence within a system but correspondence with reality, however elusive and problematic that correspondence may be. And to give up on this, to reduce meaning to a mere interpretive stance, feels like giving up on something essential, something worth preserving even if we cannot fully explain it, even if it leads to paradoxes and tensions that resist resolution. Because the alternative is a world where nothing means anything, where language floats free of reality, where thought is cut loose from the world, and that is a world too empty, too barren, too divorced from lived experience to be acceptable, even if it is theoretically cleaner, even if it avoids the hard problems, even if it makes philosophy easier by making meaning disappear. Belief does not wait for evidence, does not require justification, does not emerge from careful reasoning, but appears fully formed, arrives with conviction intact, and only afterward does the mind scramble to find reasons, to construct arguments, to build the scaffolding of rationality around a conclusion that was never reached through rationality in the first place. And this sequence is backward from what is taught, from what people believe about their own thinking, from the narrative that says humans are rational creatures who form beliefs by weighing evidence and following logic to wherever it leads. But the narrative is false, is a story the conscious mind tells about processes. It does not control and barely witnesses, because the formation of belief happens beneath awareness, happens in systems that operate according to principles that have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with survival, with coalition, with identity, with the deep need to belong to a group and signal loyalty to that group through the adoption of its beliefs. And the adoption is not chosen, is not deliberate, is automatic, is the result of exposure and repetition and emotional resonance. And once a belief is formed, it becomes self-protecting, becomes resistant to challenge, becomes the lens through which all subsequent information is filtered. And the filter is not neutral, does not simply organize data, but actively distorts it, amplifies what confirms, and minimizes what contradicts. And this distortion is not dishonesty, but cognition, is the normal operation of a mind that is not designed to find truth, but to maintain coherence, to protect existing beliefs from disintegration, to avoid the cognitive and social costs of changing one's mind. And the costs are often higher than the costs of being wrong, because being wrong in private is invisible, but changing one's mind in public is betrayal, is defection, is the signal that one is unreliable, is not committed, is willing to abandon the group. And groups punish this, punish uncertainty, punish the appearance of wavering, reward certainty even when the certainty is unjustified, especially when it is unjustified. Because justified certainty requires evidence, and evidence is ambiguous, and ambiguity is threatening to group cohesion, but unjustified certainty, certainty that comes from faith, from commitment, from identity, is the strongest signal of loyalty, is the proof that one believes not because the evidence compels, but because the group demands, and this demand is the engine of belief, is what makes convictions stick, what makes them resistant to argument, what makes smart people believe wrong things, not despite their intelligence, but because of it. Because intelligence is a tool, and tools can be used for any purpose, including the purpose of defending beliefs that were never formed through intelligence in the first place. And the defense is sophisticated, is elaborate, is often more complex than the defenses offered by less intelligent believers, because the intelligent mind has more resources, more information, more ability to construct rationalizations that sound convincing, that appear logical, that give the impression of having been arrived at through careful thought when really they are working backward from a conclusion that was never in question. And the conclusion was never in question because it was not a conclusion but a premise, was not the end of reasoning but the beginning, was the starting point that determined which evidence would be noticed, which arguments would be persuasive, which authorities would be trusted. And trust is not distributed evenly across all sources, but is allocated according to alignment, according to whether the source supports the belief or challenges it. And sources that support are credible, are reliable, are worth listening to, while sources that challenge are biased, are corrupt, are motivated by hidden agendas. And this asymmetry is not recognized by the believer, is not seen as bias but as discernment, as the ability to distinguish good information from bad. And the distinguishing is easy because good information is information that confirms, and bad information is information that contradicts. And this is motivated reasoning, is the process by which the mind arrives at the conclusions it wants to arrive at while maintaining the illusion of objectivity, the sense that the conclusion was forced by evidence rather than selected in advance, and the illusion is convincing, is believed by the person doing the reasoning, is not cynical manipulation, but sincere self-deception, is the mind fooling itself, because being fooled is useful, is adaptive, is what allows people to hold beliefs with confidence, even when the beliefs are unsupported, and confidence is what matters socially, is what others respond to, is what makes a belief persuasive, not because it's true, but because it's held strongly, and strength of conviction is mistaken for strength of evidence, is treated as signal that the believer knows something, has access to information, has done the thinking, when really the strength comes from identity, from the fact that the belief is tied to who the person is, to what group they belong to what side they are on. And sides are not chosen through reasoning, are chosen through affiliation, through accidents of birth and circumstance, through exposure to certain narratives at formative moments. And once the side is chosen, the beliefs come with it, come as package, come as the price of membership. And the price is paid gladly, because membership is worth more than truth, is worth more than accuracy, is the thing that makes life meaningful, that provides identity, that offers protection. And protection requires conformity, requires that everyone in the group believes the same things, or at least claims to believe them. And the claiming becomes believing through repetition, through public commitment, through the performance of belief that eventually converts into genuine conviction. And the conversion happens without awareness, happens gradually, happens through the mechanism that psychologists call cognitive dissonance reduction, where the mind alters beliefs to match behavior because behavior is harder to change, is more visible, is more socially consequential, and so the internal adjusts to match the external, and what was performed becomes believed, and what was believed becomes identity. And identity is the deepest level, is the level at which challenge feels like attack, like assault on the self, and the self defends, mobilizes resources, recruits intelligence in service of protection, and intelligence is effective, is dangerous in this role, because it can construct arguments that are superficially compelling, that exploit real ambiguities in evidence, that find the weak points in opposing positions. And these arguments are not offered in search of truth, but in defense of identity. Are weapons, not tools, are designed to win, not to discover, and winning means making the other side look wrong, look foolish, look motivated by bias, and the accusation of bias is always available, is always applicable, because everyone is biased, everyone is motivated, everyone is reasoning from premises they did not choose, and cannot justify except by appeal to other premises they also did not choose. And so the accusations are symmetrical, are hurled back and forth, without resolution, without movement, without any possibility of convergence, because convergence would require both sides to treat truth as the goal, to be willing to change their minds if evidence demanded it. But evidence never demands anything. Evidence is passive, is interpreted, is filtered through the beliefs that are already in place. And the beliefs that are already in place are determined by identity, by group membership, by tribal affiliation, and tribes do not care about truth except insofar as truth claims serve tribal interests, serve to distinguish us from them, serve to mark boundaries, to maintain cohesion, to provide narratives that explain why we are good and they are bad, why our beliefs are justified and theirs are delusions. And the asymmetry is total, is never recognized as asymmetry, but always experienced as accurate perception, as seeing clearly while others are blind, and the blindness is attributed to stupidity or dishonesty or indoctrination, never to the same mechanisms that are operating in oneself, because one's own beliefs are transparent, are not seen as beliefs but as obvious facts, as the way things are, and the way things are is not up for debate, is not subject to revision, is the foundation on which everything else is built. And challenging the foundation threatens the structure, threatens everything. And so the challenge is rejected, is deflected, is met with hostility or mockery, or the dismissal that treats the challenger as not worth engaging, as beneath consideration, as so obviously wrong that responding would be a waste of time. And the waste is avoided, the belief is preserved, the identity is protected, and life continues with certainty intact, with the conviction that one is right, has always been right, will always be right, because being right is not a state that can be verified, but is a state that is claimed, is performed, is the stance that the group requires and the individual provides. And the providing is not sacrifice, but fulfillment, is not loss, but gain, is the way that belonging is achieved, is the way that meaning is found, is the way that the chaos of existence is organized into a coherent narrative where the self is on the right side, is part of the good, is aligned with truth, even if truth is never actually encountered, never actually sought, never actually valued except as a rhetorical weapon to use against opponents. And opponents are necessary, are required by the logic of tribal epistemology, are the ones whose wrongness confirms our rightness, whose existence justifies our beliefs, whose errors prove our accuracy, and the errors are easy to find, because looking for errors is what confirmation bias does, is the selective attention that notices everything that supports the belief and overlooks everything that contradicts it. And the overlooking is not deliberate, is not conscious suppression, but automatic filtering. Is the mind attending to what it expects, what it is primed to see? And the priming comes from belief, comes from the framework that determines what is salient, what is relevant, what is worth noticing, and what is worth noticing is always what confirms, is always what can be incorporated into the narrative, and the narrative is not discovered but constructed, is built from selected pieces of evidence that are arranged to tell a story, and the story is always the same story, is always the one where we are right and they are wrong, where our beliefs are based on evidence and theirs are based on bias, where we are rational and they are emotional, where we are honest seekers of truth and they are motivated by power or fear, or some other corrupt motive, and the motives that are attributed to others are never attributed to the self, are never seen as operating in one's own reasoning, because one's own reasoning is transparent, is experienced as simply responding to facts, as following evidence, as arriving at conclusions that are forced rather than chosen, and the forcing as illusion is the feeling that arises when motivated reasoning is operating smoothly. When the mind has successfully convinced itself that the conclusion it wanted to reach is the conclusion that evidence demands, and the demand is retroactive, is constructed after the fact, is the rationalization that makes the belief feel justified, that allows it to be held with confidence, that enables the believer to defend it against challenge and feel virtuous in the defending. And virtue is the reward, is what makes belief feel good, feel right, feel like something more than preference, and the more than preference is what gives belief its power, its capacity to motivate action, to organize communities, to inspire sacrifice, because preference can be changed, can be updated, can be revealed as merely subjective, but belief that is felt as knowledge, as truth, as correspondence to reality, is not subject to change, is not vulnerable to challenge, is the rock on which identity is built. And the rock is not geology but psychology, is not objective but constructed, is not discovered in the world but imposed on the world. And the imposition is what makes the world intelligible, what makes experience coherent, what prevents the vertigo of radical uncertainty. And uncertainty is intolerable, is the state that humans will do almost anything to avoid, will believe almost anything to escape. And the escape is into certainty, into conviction, into the feeling of knowing. And the feeling is what matters, is what provides comfort, is what makes belief functional regardless of whether it is true. And truth is a secondary concern, is something that is appealed to but not pursued, is a value that is claimed but not practiced, because practicing it would require epistemic humility, would require admitting that one could be wrong, that one's beliefs could be mistaken, that the group could be misguided. And these admissions are costly, are signals of weakness, are invitations for opponents to attack. An attack is what happens when certainty is dropped, when doubt is expressed, when the fortress of belief shows cracks and the cracks are not tolerated, are repaired immediately, are filled with rationalizations and justifications, and appeals to authority. And authority is not expertise but alignment, is not knowledge but membership, is the voice of the group speaking through individuals who have internalized its beliefs so thoroughly that they cannot distinguish their own thoughts from the thoughts they were given, and the giving is not noticed, is not experienced as indoctrination, but as education, as the transmission of knowledge, as the inheritance of wisdom. And wisdom is what every group claims to possess, is the special access to truth that justifies its existence, that explains why belonging matters, why loyalty is required, why defection is unforgivable, and the unforgivable is treated with expulsion, with shunning, with the withdrawal of recognition that makes social existence possible. And the possibility of this withdrawal is what keeps believers in line, keeps them performing the beliefs, even when doubt arises, even when evidence contradicts, even when the rational part of the mind recognizes that the belief is unsupported, because the rational part is weak, is outvoted by the social part, by the emotional part, by the parts that understand that survival depends on belonging, and belonging depends on belief. And so belief is maintained, is performed, is protected against challenge, not because it is true, but because it's necessary, is the price of membership, is the cost of identity, and the cost is paid continuously, is paid in the suppression of doubt, in the dismissal of contrary evidence, in the construction of elaborate rationalizations that allow the belief to persist despite its failures, despite its contradictions, despite the mounting evidence that it is wrong, and wrong is what every belief eventually becomes, is the fate of all convictions that are held rigidly, that refuse to update, that treat themselves as final, as complete, as not subject to revision, because the world changes, because evidence accumulates, because what was plausible becomes implausible, and the implausible becomes undeniable, and the undeniable is denied anyway, is rejected through the mechanisms of motivated reasoning that are so powerful, so sophisticated, so effective at maintaining belief in the face of counter-evidence that they can preserve convictions long after those convictions have ceased to correspond to anything in reality. And the lack of correspondence does not matter, does not affect the strength of belief, does not reduce confidence, because belief is not about correspondence, is not about mapping the world accurately, is about maintaining identity, maintaining belonging, maintaining the narratives that make the group cohere. And coherence is more important than accuracy, is more valuable than truth, is what holds communities together, what makes collective action possible, what allows humans to coordinate at scale. And scale requires shared belief, requires that everyone is operating from the same assumptions, the same frameworks, the same narratives, and the sharing is not achieved through evidence, but through repetition, through ritual, through the constant reinforcement of the beliefs that define the group. And the reinforcement is everywhere, is in the stories that are told, the heroes that are celebrated, the enemies that are vilified, the history that is remembered, and the history that is forgotten, and the remembering and forgetting are selective, are curated to support the narrative, to make the group look good, to make its beliefs seem justified, seem necessary, seem like the only reasonable position. And reasonableness is performance, is the appearance of having arrived at belief through rational process, when really the process is post hoc, is the construction of justification for conclusions that were reached through identity, through emotion, through the non-rational processes that govern most of human belief. And the most is almost all, is the vast majority of what people believe, is believed not because evidence compels, but because believing is required, is expected, is the condition of membership in the groups that provide meaning and purpose and protection. And without these groups, the individual is lost, is isolated, is without framework, without narrative, without the stories that make sense of suffering, that explain why things happen, that provide hope that the future will be better, or at least that the struggle is meaningful. And meaning is what belief provides, is the primary function, is more important than accuracy, more valuable than truth. Because humans can tolerate being wrong, but cannot tolerate meaninglessness, cannot survive without the sense that life is going somewhere, that actions matter, that the side they are on is the right side, and the right side is always the side they are on, is always the group they belong to, is determined by belonging rather than determining it. And this circularity is invisible, is not recognized as circularity, but experienced as logical necessity, as the way things obviously are. And the obvious is what is most suspect, is what most needs examination, is where belief is most rigid, most defended, most immune to challenge, because the obvious is the foundation, is the premise that cannot be questioned without everything else collapsing, and collapse is unacceptable, is the threat that keeps belief in place, that makes certainty feel like safety and doubt feel like danger, and so certainty wins, always. Wins not because it is right, but because it is functional, is what the mind needs to operate, to make decisions, to navigate the world, and navigation does not require truth, only requires consistency, requires beliefs that are stable enough to be acted upon. And stability is what identity provides, is what tribal epistemology achieves, is the freezing of belief into doctrine, into dogma, into the unquestionable truths that define the group and exclude the other. And exclusion is the point, is the function, is what makes identity possible. Because identity is not what you are, but what you're not, is defined by boundaries, by the line that separates us from them, believers from heretics, the enlightened from the deluded. And the delusion is always on the other side, is always what they suffer from, never what afflicts us, because we see clearly we have truth, we are right, and the rightness is not a conclusion but a premise, is not the end of inquiry, but the foreclosing of inquiry, is the state that belief aims for and maintains through every mechanism available, through confirmation bias, through motivated reasoning, through tribal epistemology, through the subordination of truth to identity. And the subordination is complete, is total, is the condition of believing anything at all. Because belief without evidence is not the exception, but the rule is not a failure of reasoning, but the normal operation of minds that are not designed for truth, but for survival, for belonging, for the construction of narratives that make life bearable. And bearable is all that is required, is all that can be expected, is the standard that belief meets regardless of whether it meets any other standard, and other standards are luxuries, are the concerns of those who have the security to question, to doubt, to examine their beliefs, without fearing the social consequences. But most do not have this security. Most cannot afford doubt, cannot risk uncertainty, cannot survive without the conviction that they are right, that their beliefs are justified, that the group they belong to has access to truth, and the access is never demonstrated, never verified, never subjected to test, is only asserted, only performed, only maintained through the constant repetition of the beliefs that constitute the group. And the constitution is circular, is self-referential, is the tautology that defines all tribal epistemology. That we are right because we believe what we believe, and we believe what we believe because we are right. And the circle is unbreakable from within, can only be seen from outside, from the perspective of someone who does not share the belief, who has not internalized the identity, who can see the mechanisms operating, and the seeing changes. Nothing convinces no one, because the believer is not operating from evidence and cannot be swayed by evidence, is operating from identity and can only be swayed by changes in identity. by shifts in belonging, by the rare and difficult transformation that allows a person to leave one group and join another, to abandon one set of beliefs and adopt another. And the adoption is not reasoned, but is the same non-rational process operating in a different direction, is the formation of new convictions without evidence, is the replacement of one certainty with another certainty. And the certainty is what matters, is what the mind needs, is what belief provides, regardless of content, regardless of truth, regardless of anything except the function of making the world intelligible, making the self coherent, making belonging possible. And possibility is all that belief promises, is all that it delivers, is the opening of a space where life can be lived with conviction, with purpose, with the sense that one knows what is true and what is false, what is good and what is evil, what side to be on and what side to oppose, and the opposition is necessary, is required by the structure of belief, is what makes belief matter, what gives it weight, what makes it worth defending, worth fighting for, worth holding on to, even when every rational consideration suggests it should be abandoned, because abandoning belief is abandoning identity, is abandoning belonging, is abandoning meaning, and meaning is what makes existence tolerable, is what makes life worth living. And this worth is not measured in truth, but in function, not in correspondence, but in coherence, not in accuracy, but in the capacity to organize experience into narratives that can be shared, that can be believed, that can be held, with the conviction that comes not from evidence but from faith. And faith is not the opposite of reason, but its foundation, is the ground on which all reasoning occurs, is the set of premises that cannot themselves be justified but must be assumed, must be taken on faith, must be believed without evidence, because evidence requires premises, and premises require faith, and the faith is inescapable, is built into the structure of belief, is what makes belief possible, is what makes the mechanics of belief mechanical, automatic, operating below awareness, producing convictions that arrive fully formed and are only later dressed in the clothing of reason, given the appearance of having been derived from evidence when really they were derived from identity, from belonging, from the deep and desperate human need to be part of something larger, to believe something strongly, to know with certainty, even if the knowing is illusion, and the certainty is performance, and the belief is wrong. When believing everything means believing nothing, an author writes a book, spends years researching, checking facts, verifying claims, ensuring that every statement is as accurate as possible. And yet in the preface, the author writes something strange, writes that despite all efforts, there are surely errors somewhere in the book, that some claims are probably false, that the author believes there are mistakes, even though every individual claim was carefully checked and believed to be true when written. And this creates a paradox, because the author believes each individual claim in the book, believes claim 1 and claim 2 and claim 3 and so on, through hundreds of claims, but also believes that the conjunction of all these claims contains at least one falsehood, believes that not all of them are true together. And this seems irrational, seems like a contradiction, because if you believe P and you believe Q, then surely you should believe P and Q, surely belief should be closed under conjunction, surely rational agents should believe the logical consequences of what they believe. Yet the preface paradox shows a case where this principle fails, where following it would be irrational, where the reasonable stance is to believe each claim individually while denying their conjunction. And this has profound implications for epistemology, for theories of rational belief, for the question of whether knowledge requires certainty, for the relationship between fallibilism and rational consistency. The paradox was first formulated by Mackinson in the 1960s, though the underlying tension had been noticed earlier, and it arises from the combination of two plausible principles. First, that one can rationally believe each of a set of propositions while recognizing that the set probably contains errors. And second, that rational belief should be closed under conjunction should require that if you believe P and believe Q, then you believe P and Q, and these principles cannot both be true. At least one must be abandoned. And the question is, which one? And this is not merely technical, not merely a puzzle for logicians, but strikes at the heart of what it means to be rational. What constraints logic places on belief? Whether consistency is a requirement of rationality or merely an ideal that fallible beings cannot always achieve. The standard response is to deny closure, to say that belief is not closed under conjunction, that you can rationally believe P and believe Q without believing P and Q. And this seems counterintuitive, seems to violate basic logic, but the alternative seems worse, seems to require either that the author disbelieves some of the claims in the book, despite having good evidence for each, or that the author believed the conjunction, despite knowing it probably contains errors. And both of these options are clearly irrational, clearly violate norms of good reasoning. And so denying closure seems like the least bad option, seems like the way to preserve rationality in the face of the paradox. But it comes at a cost, the cost of admitting that rational agents can have beliefs that are logically inconsistent, that violate the most basic principles of logic. And this threatens the entire project of formal epistemology, the project of modelling rational belief using probability or logic or some other formal system. Because if belief does not obey logical constraints, then what does it obey? What makes belief rational, if not conformity to logical principles? Kuyberg's approach was to distinguish between belief and acceptance, between what one takes to be true for theoretical purposes and what one is willing to act on. And he argued that acceptance can violate closure, can be rationally inconsistent, can involve accepting P and accepting Q, while not accepting P and Q. Because acceptance is not about subjective confidence, but about practical reasoning, about what to assume for purposes of inquiry or action. And the preface shows that practical rationality sometimes requires accepting things that are logically inconsistent. And this is not irrationality, but recognition of fallibility, recognition that any complex set of beliefs probably contains errors, even if we cannot identify which ones. And the rational response is not to pretend the beliefs are certain, but to acknowledge their fallibility while continuing to use them. And this means living with inconsistency, living with the knowledge that our belief system is flawed even as we rely on it. And this is the human epistemic condition, the condition of beings who must act on incomplete information, who must form beliefs that are individually well supported but collectively unreliable, who must navigate between the Scylla of skepticism and the Charybdis of overconfidence. The lottery paradox is closely related. Imagine a fair lottery with 1 million tickets, one will win, and you believe of each ticket that it will not win because the probability is only 1 in a million. And this seems rational, seems like you should believe of each ticket that it will lose. But if you believe this of each ticket, then by conjunction, you believe that no ticket will win. Yet you know that some ticket will win. And so your beliefs are inconsistent. You believe that ticket 1 will not win, and ticket 2 will not win, and so on for all 1 million tickets. But you also believe that some ticket will win, and these cannot all be true. And this shows that high probability is not sufficient for rational belief, that you cannot simply believe everything that is highly probable, because doing so will lead to inconsistency. And this is another blow to probabilistic theories of belief. Another way that formal models fail to capture actual rational belief, because the model says you should believe everything above some probability threshold. But the lottery shows that this leads to contradiction, leads to believing things that logically cannot all be true. Foley argued that rationality does not require consistency, that it is possible for a rational person to have inconsistent beliefs, not because they are making a mistake, but because consistency is not always achievable, not always compatible with other rational goals, like believing what the evidence supports. And the preface paradox shows this, shows a case where the evidence supports each individual belief, but also supports the belief that the conjunction is false. And there is no way to make these beliefs consistent without abandoning some belief that the evidence supports. And so the rational thing is to live with the inconsistency, to acknowledge it, to be aware of it, but not to try to eliminate it by arbitrarily rejecting beliefs that are well supported. And this is a radical departure from traditional epistemology. Traditional epistemology assumed that consistency was a minimal requirement of rationality, that a rational agent had to have consistent beliefs. But Foley argues this is too demanding. This is an ideal that finite fallible creatures cannot always meet, and rationality requires doing the best we can with limited information and limited cognitive resources. And sometimes the best we can do involves having beliefs that are, strictly speaking, inconsistent. Harman distinguished between what he called content inconsistency and attitude inconsistency. Content inconsistency is when the contents of your beliefs cannot all be true together, like believing P and believing not P. While attitude inconsistency is when your attitudes do not fit together properly, like believing P while also suspending judgment about P. And he argued that attitude consistency is required for rationality, but content consistency is not. That you can rationally believe things whose contents are inconsistent as long as your attitudes toward them are appropriate, as long as you have the right degree of confidence, the right willingness to revise, the right acknowledgement of fallibility. And the preface case involves content inconsistency, but not attitude inconsistency. The author's attitudes are perfectly appropriate. The author believes each claim to the degree the evidence supports, believes the conjunction contains errors to the degree the evidence supports, and there is no attitude, confusion, no inappropriate confidence, no failure of rationality, only the inevitable content inconsistency that comes from being a fallible believer in a complex world. The connection to fallibilism is direct. Fallibilism is the view that knowledge does not require certainty, that one can know something while acknowledging the possibility of error. And if fallibilism is true, then one can know each claim in the book, while knowing that the book probably contains errors, can have knowledge that is individually solid but collectively flawed. And this means knowledge itself can be inconsistent, can involve knowing P and knowing Q and knowing not P and Q. And this seems deeply strange, seems to violate the principle that knowledge is factive, that if you know P, then P is true, because if you know P and know Q, then P and Q are both true, and so P and Q is true. And if you know P and Q is false, then you know something false which is impossible. And so the paradox reappears at the level of knowledge, not just belief. And the only escape is to deny that knowledge is closed under conjunction, to say that you can know P and know Q without knowing P and Q. And this has been called the most counterintuitive consequence of fallibilism. The idea that knowledge is not closed under obvious entailment, that you can know premises without knowing their logical consequences. That logic does not preserve knowledge in the way we thought it did. Williamson defends closure by denying that the author knows each individual claim, arguing that knowledge requires not just truth and justification, but safety, requires that the belief could not easily have been false. And in the preface case, many of the beliefs, though true and justified, could easily have been false. The author could easily have made mistakes, and so they do not count as knowledge. And this preserves closure at the cost of making knowledge very demanding, at the cost of saying that the careful author who double-checks everything still does not know most of what is in the book. And this seems wrong, seems to set the bar for knowledge too high, seems to imply that scientists do not know most of what they publish, that historians do not know the claims in their monographs, that fallible inquiry never produces knowledge. And if this is the cost of preserving closure, then maybe closure is not worth preserving. Maybe we should accept that knowledge is not closed, and that this is a feature, not a bug, a recognition that knowledge is a gradient, comes in degrees, is not an all or nothing status, but a matter of how well beliefs are supported and how carefully they have been checked. The problem connects to peer disagreement, because if an author believes all the claims in a book but also believes the book contains errors, and a peer believes all the same claims, then they agree on every individual claim, but disagree about whether the conjunction is true, or rather they both agree the conjunction is probably false, but cannot specify where the errors are. And this is a strange kind of agreement. Disagreement is consensus that there is error without consensus about what is erroneous, and this is the situation science often finds itself in. Scientists agree on individual results, but no. The overall body of accepted claims contains errors that will be corrected by future research. And this does not make science irrational, does not mean scientists should be less confident, does not mean they should reject any of the claims they currently accept. It just means they should be humble, should recognize fallibility, should maintain what Peirce called the scientific attitude, the attitude of permanent openness to revision, of treating all beliefs as provisional, of accepting that today's knowledge is tomorrow's error. And this attitude is not skepticism, not the denial that we know anything, but fallibilism, the recognition that what we know imperfectly, that our epistemic achievements are real but limited, that confidence and humility must coexist. Christensen argues that the preface paradox shows that rational belief is not belief in the ordinary sense, that what we should be modelling is not belief but credence, not all or nothing acceptance but degrees of confidence, and if we model belief as high credence, then the paradox dissolves, because you can have high credence in P and high credence in Q, while having lower credence in P and Q, you can assign 0.95 probability to each of 100 claims, while assigning low probability to their conjunction, because probabilities of conjunctions are products and products of many numbers, less than one are small. And this seems to solve the paradox, seems to show it was an artifact of treating belief as all or nothing. But it does not really solve it, because the preface author does not just have high credence in each claim. The author believes each claim, is willing to assert each claim, has written a book endorsing each claim. And this is not just high credence, but commitment, is not just 0.95 confidence, but the stance of taking something to be true. And this stance seems to require consistency, seems to be the kind of thing that should obey logical constraints. And the paradox shows that this intuition is wrong, that belief as commitment can be rationally inconsistent, that human cognition involves taking stances that do not add up logically, and this is not a failure but a necessity, a consequence of being the kind of creatures we are, creatures who must act decisively on uncertain information, who must commit to claims while acknowledging fallibility, who must hold inconsistent beliefs without becoming paralyzed by the inconsistency. The legal system faces this problem constantly. Juries are told to find defendants guilty only if guilt is proved beyond reasonable doubt, and they are told to consider each charge separately. And it is possible for a jury to rationally find a defendant guilty on charge 1, and guilty on charge 2, and guilty on charge 3, and guilty on charge 4, and guilty on charge 5, and guilty on charge 6, and guilty on charge 7, and guilty on charge 8, and guilty on charge 9, and guilty on charge 10, and guilty on charge 11, and guilty on charge 12, and guilty on charge 13, and guilty on charge 14, and guilty on charge 15, and guilty on charge 16, and guilty on charge 17, and guilty on charge 18, and guilty on charge 19, and guilty on charge 20, and guilty on charge 21, and guilty on charge 22, and guilty on charge 23, and guilty on charge 24, and guilty on charge 25, and guilty on charge 26, and guilty on charge 27, and guilty on charge 28, and guilty on charge 29, and guilty on charge 30, and guilty on charge 31, and guilty on charge 32, and guilty on charge 33, and guilty on charge 34, and guilty on charge 35, and guilty on charge 36, and guilty on charge 37, and guilty on charge 38, and guilty on charge 39, and guilty on charge 40, and guilty on charge 41, and guilty on charge 42, and guilty on charge 43, and guilty on charge 44, and guilty on charge 45, and guilty on charge 46, and guilty on charge 47, and guilty on charge 48, and guilty on charge 49, and guilty on charge 50, and guilty on charge 51, and guilty on charge 52, and guilty on charge 53, and guilty on charge 54, and guilty on charge 55, and guilty on charge 56, and guilty on charge 57, and guilty on charge 58, and guilty on charge 59, and guilty on charge 60, and guilty on charge 61, and guilty on charge 62, and guilty on charge 63, and guilty on charge 64, and guilty on charge 65, and guilty on charge 66, and guilty on charge 67, and guilty on charge 68, and guilty on charge 69, and guilty on charge 70, and guilty on charge 71, and guilty on charge 72, and guilty on charge 73, and guilty on charge 74, and guilty on charge 75, and guilty on charge 76, and guilty on charge 77, and guilty on charge 78, and guilty on charge 79, and guilty on charge 80, and guilty on charge 81, and guilty on charge 82, and guilty on charge 83, and guilty on charge 84, and guilty on charge 85, and guilty on charge 86, and guilty on charge 87, and guilty on charge 88, and guilty on charge 89, and guilty on charge 90, and guilty on charge 91, and guilty on charge 92, and guilty on charge 93, and guilty on charge 94, and guilty on charge 95, and guilty on charge 96, and guilty on charge 97, and guilty on charge 98, and guilty on charge 99, and guilty on charge 100, and guilty on charge 101, and guilty on charge 102, and guilty on charge 103, and guilty on charge 104, and guilty on charge 105, and guilty on charge 106, and guilty on charge 107, and guilty on charge 108, and guilty on charge 109, and guilty on charge 110, and guilty on charge 111, and guilty on charge 112, and guilty on charge 113, and guilty on charge 114, and guilty on charge 115, and guilty on charge 116, and guilty on charge 117, and guilty on charge 118, and guilty on charge 119, and guilty on charge 120, and guilty on charge 121, and guilty on charge 122, and guilty on charge 123, and guilty on charge 124, and guilty on charge 125, and guilty on charge 126, and guilty on charge 127, and guilty on charge 128, and guilty on charge 129, and guilty on charge 130, and guilty on charge 131, and guilty on charge 132, and guilty on charge 133, and guilty on charge 134, and guilty on charge 135, and guilty on charge 136, and guilty on charge 137, and guilty on charge 138, and guilty on charge 139, and guilty on charge 140, and guilty on charge 141, and guilty on charge 142, and guilty on charge 143, and guilty on charge 144, and guilty on charge 145, and guilty on charge 146, and guilty on charge 147, and guilty on charge 148, and guilty on charge 149, and guilty on charge 150, and guilty on charge 151, and guilty on charge 152, and 2, but not guilty of the conjunction if the conjunction requires proving additional facts beyond what is needed for the individual charges. And this is not. Irrational, not a failure of the jury, but reflects the structure of legal reasoning, reflects the difference between individual sufficient confidence and conjunctive sufficient confidence, and the law recognizes this by allowing separate verdicts on separate charges, by not requiring that verdicts on individual charges entail verdicts on conjunctions, and this is a practical recognition of what the preface paradox reveals theoretically, that consistency is not always achievable, that rational decision-making sometimes requires accepting things that logically conflict, that the demand for perfect consistency would paralyze action and judgment. The Buddhist concept of holding views lightly, of believing without clinging, of maintaining epistemic humility, resembles the attitude the preface paradox recommends, the attitude of believing each claim while believing one is probably wrong somewhere, of committing to specific positions while remaining open to error, of avoiding both dogmatism and relativism by taking stands while acknowledging their provisional nature. And this is not inconsistency in the sense of confused thinking, but inconsistency in the sense of recognizing that one's epistemic state does not and cannot achieve logical closure, that believing is always an ongoing process of revision rather than a finished state of certainty, and Western epistemology is slowly coming to acknowledge what Buddhist philosophy has long insisted, that the demand for certainty is the demand for something humans cannot achieve, that wisdom involves accepting uncertainty, that rationality is compatible with inconsistency when the inconsistency reflects fallibility rather than confusion. The preface paradox has no solution that everyone accepts, no way to dissolve it that does not involve rejecting some deeply held intuition about rationality or belief or logic. And this is characteristic of the deepest philosophical problems. They reveal tensions between principles we are reluctant to abandon. They force choices we are reluctant to make. They show that our concepts do not fit together as neatly as we assumed. And the preface paradox does all of this, forces us to choose between closure and fallibilism, between logical consistency and epistemic humility, between formal models of belief and actual believing. And whatever choice we make comes at a cost, comes with counterintuitive implications, comes with the recognition that rationality is more complex, more contextual, more human than formal epistemology imagined. And perhaps this is the real lesson of the paradox. Not that we need to solve it, but that we need to accept that it cannot be solved, that it reveals a permanent tension in human epistemic life, a tension between the demand for consistency and the reality of fallibility, and learning to live with that tension, learning to believe carefully while acknowledging error, learning to take stands while remaining humble is not a failure of rationality, but its highest achievement.